At the wedding rehearsal, my husband was with my pregnant sister. "We need to talk." Those 4 words still echo in my mind like a bell tolling at midnight. I never imagined betrayal could wear such a familiar face. Before I share what happened next, I need you to know something. This story isn't easy to tell. And if you've ever felt the ground shift beneath your feet when someone you trusted broke your heart, then what I'm about to share might feel painfully familiar. If these stories matter to you, if they help you feel less alone in your own struggles, please hit that like button and subscribe. Your support helps this message reach others who desperately need to hear it, who need to know they're not the only ones fighting these battles in silence. I was 63 years old, standing in the grand ballroom of the Riverside Plaza Hotel in downtown Chicago, smoothing down my navy blue dress, the one I'd bought specifically for my younger sister Amy's wedding rehearsal. The fabric felt expensive against my skin. Silk blended with something synthetic that made it drape just right. I'd spent $200 on it, money I'd saved from my part-time bookkeeping job, because I wanted to look put together, wanted to show everyone that Margaret Eleanor Hartwell still had it together after all these years. The chandelier overhead cast warm light across the polished wooden floors, and I could smell the faint aroma of garlic and butter wafting from the kitchen where they were preparing tomorrow's reception feast. White roses adorned every table, their petals perfect and unblemished, mocking me with their purity. I remember taking a moment to appreciate the space before everything fell apart. The Riverside Plaza was one of Chicago's historic venues, the kind of place where old money families held their celebrations. Amy had been so excited when Derek proposed hosting their wedding here. She'd called me immediately after they'd secured the booking, her voice high and breathless with joy. "Maggie," she'd said. She was the only one who still called me that. "You won't believe it. The Riverside Plaza. Can you imagine? Me? Getting married at the Riverside Plaza." I'd been happy for her then, genuinely happy. My baby sister, finally settling down at 43, finally finding someone who seemed to truly love her. I'd even helped her negotiate the catering contract, using my accounting skills to make sure she wasn't being overcharged. My husband Jim had disappeared about 20 minutes earlier. I'd watched him slip away during the rehearsal itself, right when the wedding planner was instructing Amy and her fiancé Derek on how to exchange their vows. At first, I didn't think much of it. Jim was always restless during formal events, always finding excuses to step outside for air or check his phone for work emails. He ran a consulting firm, or so he told everyone, though I handled most of the actual accounting and client communications from our home office. The real money, I'd learned over our 41 years of marriage, came from investments he'd made early on, a small fortune he'd parlayed into something resembling wealth through careful stock picks and real estate deals I barely understood. But looking back now, I can see all the signs I missed. The way he'd been checking his phone constantly for the past few weeks, angling the screen away from me. The late-night conference calls that seemed to happen more and more frequently. The new cologne he'd started wearing, something spicier, younger than his usual understated scent. The way he'd insisted on attending this rehearsal dinner even though he usually tried to get out of family obligations. I'd thought he was finally making an effort with Amy, finally accepting her as part of our lives after years of barely concealed indifference. How naive I'd been. I walked through the ballroom, smiling at distant cousins I hadn't seen in years. At Amy's friends from her yoga studio, who all looked impossibly young and flexible. My feet hurt in my new heels, black pumps with a modest 2-inch heel that still managed to pinch my toes. I kept searching for Jim's silver hair, that distinctive streak of white at his temple that had always made him look distinguished rather than old. When I couldn't find him in the main room, I checked the lobby. Not there. The men's room. I waited outside like some desperate wife in a bad movie, but he never emerged. I stood in that marble-floored lobby for what felt like an eternity, watching other guests come and go. A young couple passed me, the woman's hand resting on her rounded belly, her partner hovering close with that mixture of pride and anxiety that new fathers-to-be always seem to carry. They were laughing about something, their heads close together, and I felt a pang of something I couldn't quite name. Envy, maybe. Or mourning for something I'd never had with Jim. We'd never had that kind of easy intimacy, that unguarded joy in each other's company. Then I thought to check the service corridor, that narrow hallway behind the ballroom where the catering staff wheeled their carts. I don't know what made me think of it. Maybe some instinct I'd been ignoring for too long. The fluorescent lights back there were harsh, nothing like the romantic ambiance of the main room, and I could hear the clatter of dishes and the rapid-fire Spanish of the kitchen staff preparing tomorrow's meal. The corridor smelled like commercial cleaner and food, that particular combination of lemon disinfectant and roasted meat that marks the backstage of any catering operation. I walked slowly down that hallway, my heels clicking on the industrial tile floor. There were stacks of chairs against one wall, extra linens on metal shelves, cases of wine and champagne waiting to be opened for tomorrow's celebration. I passed a server carrying a tray of dirty glasses, and she nodded at me politely, not questioning why a guest was back here in the staff-only area. Maybe she thought I was lost. Maybe she didn't care. That's when I saw them. Jim and Amy, pressed close together in a small alcove near the emergency exit. His hand was on her stomach, not just resting there casually, but curved protectively over what I now recognized as a small but unmistakable bump beneath her flowing rehearsal dress. She was crying, and he was whispering something I couldn't hear, his lips nearly touching her ear. The tenderness in his posture, the intimacy of that moment, told me everything I needed to know before my brain could even process what I was seeing. I stood there, frozen, for what might have been seconds or might have been minutes. Time did that strange thing it does in crisis moments. It stretched and compressed simultaneously. I noticed absurd details with crystalline clarity, the emergency exit sign above their heads, its red letters glowing in the dim hallway, a scuff mark on Jim's left shoe, the way Amy's hand came up to cover his, pressing it more firmly against her belly. The sound of someone laughing in the distant kitchen, a sound so incongruous with what I was witnessing that it made my head spin. My mind was racing, trying to construct some innocent explanation. Maybe she was sick. Maybe he was just being brotherly. Maybe I was misreading everything. But even as I tried to convince myself, I knew. The way they were standing, the way he was touching her, the way she was leaning into him. This wasn't brotherly. This wasn't innocent. This was something else entirely. I must have made a sound, a gasp maybe, or a whimper, because they both turned to look at me. Amy's face went pale, her hand flying to her mouth. Jim's expression shifted through several emotions in rapid succession: surprise, guilt, defiance, and finally something that looked almost like relief. As if he'd been waiting for this moment, as if carrying this secret had been exhausting him. "Margaret," he said, and his voice was calm, steady, like he was about to explain a minor accounting error. "We need to talk." I remember thinking how absurd that phrase was, how utterly inadequate for what was happening. We need to talk. As if we were discussing vacation plans or what to have for dinner. My sister, my baby sister, who I'd helped raise after our mother died when she was 12, was pregnant with my husband's child, and he wanted to talk. Amy started toward me, her hand outstretched. "Maggie, please, let me explain." But I couldn't. I couldn't stand there and listen to explanations or excuses or whatever words they thought could make this make sense. I turned and walked away. I didn't run, didn't make a scene. I simply walked back through that service corridor, through the kitchen where the staff pretended not to notice my tears, back into the ballroom where everyone was laughing and toasting to Amy's happiness. The noise hit me like a physical force. All those people, talking and laughing, celebrating a wedding that wasn't going to happen. Or maybe it would happen. Maybe Derek didn't know. Maybe I was the only fool who'd been kept in the dark. I wanted to scream. I wanted to stand on a chair and tell everyone what I'd just seen. Instead, I found my purse on our assigned table, table number 3, right near the front where family was supposed to sit. I picked it up, felt the weight of my wallet and keys and all the small things that make up a life, and I walked out of that hotel into the Chicago evening. The November air hit my face like a slap. It was cold, properly cold, the kind of cold that cuts through expensive silk dresses and makes your bones ache. I stood on the sidewalk outside the Riverside Plaza, watching cabs zip past, watching couples walk by holding hands, watching the city move forward while my world had just stopped spinning. A city bus rumbled past, its brakes squealing, and I caught my reflection in its windows. A 63-year-old woman in a navy blue dress, standing alone, looking lost. People flowed around me on the sidewalk like water around a stone. A group of young professionals in business casual, probably heading to happy hour somewhere. A homeless man pushing a shopping cart filled with plastic bags. A mother with 2 small children. The kids bundled up in puffy winter coats, arguing about something in that way children do. Normal life, continuing all around me while my own life had just been detonated. I started walking. I didn't have a destination in mind, just needed to move, needed to put distance between myself and that hotel. My feet hurt in those damn heels, but the pain felt appropriate somehow. Physical pain I could understand, could locate, could name. The emotional devastation was too big, too shapeless, too overwhelming to process. I walked for blocks, past shops closing for the evening, past restaurants with warm light spilling from their windows, past the river where the water looked black and cold in the fading light. I finally stopped at a corner and realized I had no idea where I was. I'd been walking blind, following some autopilot instinct that had taken me away from the hotel, but nowhere in particular. I took the train home. Not a cab, not an Uber, the L train, the red line that I'd ridden thousands of times over the decades I'd lived in this city. I needed the normalcy of it, the familiar screech of metal on metal, the press of strangers who didn't know me and didn't care that my life had just imploded. I sat in an orange plastic seat that had been scratched and marked with permanent marker, and I stared at nothing. When I got home to our brownstone in Lincoln Park, the house was dark. Of course it was. Jim was still at the hotel, probably explaining everything to Amy, probably making plans for their future while I rode the train alone. I unlocked the door. We had one of those old-fashioned locks that required an actual key, not the smart locks everyone was installing, and stepped into the foyer. The hardwood floors creaked under my feet, the same creak they'd made for 41 years. The familiar smell of our home, old books. The lavender potpourri I kept in bowls around the house, the faint mustiness of the basement, wrapped around me like a blanket. I didn't turn on the lights. I walked through the dark house to the kitchen and poured myself a glass of water from the tap. My hands were shaking so badly that water slopped over the rim and onto the counter. I set the glass down and gripped the edge of the sink, staring out the window at our small backyard where I'd planted tomatoes every summer for decades. The garden was bare now, just dark earth waiting for spring. That's when it really hit me. Not the betrayal itself, that was still too big, too impossible to fully comprehend, but the smaller truth underneath it. I had spent 41 years building a life with a man who could do this to me. I had given him everything, my youth, my energy, my dreams, my money. When we'd gotten married in 1984, I'd been working as a junior accountant at a firm downtown, making decent money, building a career. Jim had just started his consulting business and needed capital. I'd given him my savings, $12,000 that represented years of careful saving. He'd promised it was an investment in our future. Over the years, I'd continued to invest in that future. When his business struggled, I'd worked extra hours to cover our mortgage. When he wanted to expand, I'd co-signed loans. I'd done his books, managed his accounts receivable, chased down clients who didn't pay. And gradually, without me quite noticing when it happened, my career had become an afterthought. I was Jim's wife, Jim's support system, the invisible hand that kept everything running while he collected the credit and the profits. We never had children. I'd wanted them desperately in my 30s, but Jim had always said the timing wasn't right. The business needed more attention. We needed to build up our savings first. Maybe next year. Next year became the year after, and then I was 40, then 45, then 50, and the conversation just stopped happening. I poured all that maternal energy into Amy instead, my sister who was 20 years younger, who'd lost her mother and needed someone to help her navigate life. I'd paid for her college tuition when our father couldn't. I'd helped her through bad breakups and job losses. I'd been there for every milestone, every crisis, every triumph, and now she was pregnant with my husband's baby. I stood in that dark kitchen for I don't know how long, feeling the cold seep up through the floorboards into my feet. My mind kept circling back to the same questions, like a dog worrying at a wound. How long had this been going on? When had it started? Had there been signs I'd missed? How many times had they been together while I was working to keep his business afloat? How many lies had they told me, sitting at this very table, eating meals I'd cooked, accepting my help and my love while carrying on behind my back? Eventually, I heard a key in the front door. Jim was home. I heard his footsteps in the foyer, heard him set his keys in the ceramic dish we kept on the entry table, the dish I'd made in a pottery class I'd taken during one of my brief attempts to have hobbies of my own. He walked toward the kitchen, and I could tell by his footsteps that he was being careful, tentative. "Margaret?" His voice came from the doorway. "Can we turn on a light and talk about this?" "Talk about what exactly?" I heard myself say. My voice sounded strange, flat, and distant. "Talk about how long this has been going on? Talk about whether you love her? Talk about what you're planning to do about the baby?" He flipped the light switch, and the sudden brightness made me flinch. I turned to look at him. He was still wearing his suit from the rehearsal, but he'd loosened his tie. His face looked older than I'd ever seen it, deep lines around his mouth and eyes that I didn't remember being so pronounced. "It's been 6 months," he said quietly. "It started at that family reunion in the summer. We were both drunk, and it just happened. We didn't mean for it to happen again, but it did. And then she found out about the baby, and everything got complicated. 6 months. I did the math automatically, my accountant's brain clicking through the timeline. July, the reunion at the lake house in Wisconsin. I'd stayed home that weekend because I'd had a summer cold and didn't want to give it to everyone else. Jim had gone with Amy because she'd just broken up with some boyfriend and needed family support. I'd actually encouraged him to go, to keep an eye on her. "Does Derek know?" I asked. "No, she's going to tell him. She wanted to wait until after the wedding, but now I don't know what she's planning to do." I laughed. I actually laughed, this bitter sound that came from somewhere deep in my chest. How considerate of her. Wait until after the wedding to ruin his life. Very thoughtful. "Margaret, I know you're angry." "Angry?" I cut him off. "Jim, I am so far past angry I can't even see it from here. What I am is, I'm erased. Do you understand that? You took our entire marriage, 41 years, and you erased it. Every memory, every moment, every sacrifice I made. It's all poisoned now. I can't look back at any of it without wondering what else you were lying about." He tried to step closer, but I held up my hand. "Don't. Don't you dare come near me right now." "What do you want me to do?" he asked, and I heard something in his voice I'd never heard before. Fear. Jim had always been confident, always sure of himself and his choices. But right now, he was afraid. "I want you to leave," I said. "I want you to pack a bag and get out of this house." "This is my house too," he said. And there it was, the defensiveness creeping back in, the Jim I knew showing through the momentary vulnerability. "I paid for most of it." "With my money," I reminded him. "With the income I helped you generate, with the business I helped you build. Don't you dare throw that in my face right now." What followed was an hour of arguing that I wish I could forget. We stood in that kitchen, under those harsh lights, and said things to each other that couldn't be unsaid. Jim tried to justify it, tried to explain how it had happened, as if the mechanics of the betrayal mattered. He told me about how Amy had been vulnerable, how she'd been drinking, how one thing had led to another. As if that made it better. As if being drunk excused sleeping with your wife's sister. I asked him if he loved her. He hesitated. That pause told me everything. And then said he didn't know. He said he cared about her, said the baby changed things, said he felt responsible. Responsible. As if Amy was some obligation he'd taken on, not a conscious choice he'd made again and again for 6 months. I asked him if he loved me, if he'd ever loved me. He said yes, but it sounded hollow. It sounded like something he was supposed to say, not something he felt. When I pressed him on it, asked him when he'd stopped loving me, he couldn't answer. Or wouldn't. I'm still not sure which. He finally left. Not immediately. We argued for another hour after that initial confrontation, going in circles, saying terrible things to each other while standing in that bright kitchen. But eventually, he packed a bag and walked out. I heard his car start in the driveway, heard it pull away, and then the house was silent again. I should have felt relieved. Instead, I felt hollow. I walked through the rooms of our brownstone, this 3-story house in one of Chicago's nicest neighborhoods, this symbol of success that we'd worked so hard to afford. Every room held memories that now felt like lies. The living room where we'd hosted Christmas parties, I could still see Jim by the fireplace, playing host, charming our guests with his stories and his easy laugh. Everyone always said what a great couple we made. What a partnership. If only they'd known. The dining room where we'd entertained clients and friends. That mahogany table I'd refinished myself one summer, spending weekends stripping and sanding and staining until my hands were raw. I'd been so proud of that table. Now I couldn't look at it without wondering how many times Jim and Amy had sat there together, planning their secret life while I worked upstairs. The master bedroom where we'd shared a bed for 4 decades felt like the biggest betrayal of all. How many nights had he lain next to me, his body warm against mine, while thinking about her? How many mornings had he kissed me goodbye before going to meet Amy? The intimacy of it, of sharing a bed, a life, a home with someone who was living a completely separate existence, made my skin crawl. I found myself in our bathroom, staring at our 2 toothbrushes in the holder on the sink. Such a mundane thing, toothbrushes, but they represented something. Domesticity, partnership, the small daily rituals of a shared life. I grabbed Jim's toothbrush and threw it in the trash. It was a petty gesture, meaningless in the grand scheme of things, but it felt good. It felt like taking back some small measure of control. I ended up in what we called the study, though it was really just my office, the room where I did Jim's accounting work and managed the consulting business. I sat down at my desk and opened the laptop. It was almost 3 a.m, but I couldn't sleep. I pulled up our financial records, all the spreadsheets and accounts I'd been maintaining for years. That's when I started to see it. The pattern I'd missed because I'd been too trusting, too focused on keeping everything running smoothly. Jim had been moving money. Not large amounts all at once, that would have been too obvious, but small transfers, regular withdrawals that added up over time. I traced them back through the last 2 years and found accounts I didn't recognize, investments he'd made without telling me, expenses that didn't make sense. My accountant brain kicked into high gear, pushing aside the emotional devastation to focus on something concrete, something I could quantify and understand. I opened every statement, every record I could access. I created a new spreadsheet and started documenting everything suspicious. Each entry was like a small knife cut, not enough to kill you, but enough to bleed you slowly. There were charges at restaurants I'd never been to, always for 2 people, always during times when Jim had claimed to be meeting clients. Hotel stays in the city. Why would you need a hotel in the city where you live? Billed to a credit card I rarely checked because Jim said it was for business expenses. Charges at a jewelry store, 3 separate occasions, totaling over $5,000. I'd never received any jewelry from Jim in the past 2 years. One account, opened 18 months ago, had regular deposits, not huge sums, 500 here, 1,000 there, but consistent. I found the bank's website, tried our standard passwords, and got lucky on the 3rd try. Jim had never been creative with passwords. He used variations of our anniversary date and his mother's maiden name. The account had over $50,000 in it. The beneficiary was listed as Amy Hartwell, my sister. He'd been setting her up financially for over a year, long before that reunion where this supposedly started. I sat back in my chair and felt something inside me crystallize. This wasn't a mistake. This wasn't a drunken encounter that spiraled out of control. This was planned. This was intentional. Jim had been building a life with my sister for over a year, maybe longer, while I'd been keeping his business afloat and believing his lies. The realization hit me in waves. The first wave was shock. The recognition that the timeline he'd given me was a lie. That this had been going on far longer than 6 months. The second wave was a strange kind of clarity. All those times I'd felt something was off, all those moments when my instincts had whispered warnings that I'd dismissed as paranoia or insecurity, I'd been right. My gut had known something my brain refused to accept. The third wave was rage. Pure, white-hot rage that made my hands shake and my vision narrow. I wanted to throw the laptop across the room. I wanted to call Jim and scream at him. I wanted to drive to wherever he was staying and pound on the door and demand answers. But I didn't do any of those things. Instead, I took screenshots of everything. I downloaded statements. I printed out pages and pages of evidence. Because if I've learned anything in 41 years, it's that evidence matters. Documentation matters. When emotions are running high and everyone's trying to rewrite history, paper trails don't lie. The sun came up. I watched it through the study window, watched the light creep across the hardwood floors and illuminate the dust motes floating in the air. I made myself coffee in the French press Jim had bought me for my birthday, my 60th birthday, 3 years ago, when he'd kissed me and told me I was still the most beautiful woman he'd ever known. I wondered if he'd already been sleeping with Amy by then. The timeline suggested yes. I called in sick to my part-time bookkeeping job. Then I sat down and made a list. I'm good at lists, at organizing chaos into manageable tasks. The first item was find a lawyer. The second was secure finances. The third was document everything. By the time Jim called at 9:30, I had already called 3 divorce attorneys and had consultations scheduled for the following week. I'd transferred half of our joint savings into a new account in just my name. I downloaded and saved every financial record I could access. I'd changed the passwords on all accounts where I was the primary holder. "We need to talk about this rationally," Jim said when I answered his call. He was using his business voice, calm and reasonable, the voice he used when negotiating contracts. "I agree," I said. "You should know I've secured my financial interests and I'm filing for divorce. I'll need you to arrange to collect your belongings. You can coordinate with my attorney." "Margaret, you're overreacting. We can work through this." "Can we work through you having a baby with my sister? Can we work through you setting up secret bank accounts? Can we work through over a year of systematic deception? Please, explain to me how we work through that, Jim. I'm genuinely curious." He was silent for a long moment. Then he said, "Think about what you're throwing away. Think about our life together, everything we built." "I have thought about it," I told him. "That's exactly why I'm doing this. Goodbye, Jim." I hung up. My hands were shaking again, but this time it felt different. Not fear or shock, but adrenaline. Purpose. For the first time in as long as I could remember, I was making decisions just for myself, protecting myself, fighting for myself. The wedding was still happening. Amy called me later that day, crying, begging me to understand. but I couldn't listen. Her voice on the phone, that familiar voice that I'd heard my entire life, that had called me Maggie with such affection, now sounded like a stranger's. She was saying things like, "It just happened," and "We never meant to hurt you," and "Please try to understand." But how could I understand? How could I comprehend betrayal on this scale? "You were supposed to be my sister," I told her before I hung up. "You were supposed to be on my side. Do you know how many times I helped you? How many times I was there for you when no one else was? And this is how you repay me? By sleeping with my husband? By carrying his child?" She was crying harder now, saying she was sorry, saying she didn't know how it happened, saying she loved him. That last part, "I love him," broke something in me, because it meant this wasn't just about sex or a momentary lapse in judgment. She loved him. She had fallen in love with my husband, and he had apparently fallen in love with her, and I was just the obstacle standing between them and their happiness. I told her I needed space and I needed time, and then I blocked her number. I blocked Jim's number too. I blocked them both on social media, on email, everywhere I could think of. I wanted silence. I needed it. I needed to not hear their voices, not see their faces, not be exposed to their attempts at justification or reconciliation. I needed to exist in a world where they simply didn't exist anymore. My neighbor Susan came over that evening. She was a widow in her 70s who lived in the brownstone next to ours, and we'd been casual friends for years, the kind of neighbors who chat over the fence and borrow sugar, but don't really know each other's deeper stories. She knocked on my door holding a casserole dish. "I saw Jim loading boxes into his car this morning," she said, "and I know that look on a woman's face. This is shepherd's pie. It freezes well, and if you need to talk, I'm an excellent listener, or if you need to not talk, I'm good at that too." I invited her in. We ate shepherd's pie at my kitchen table, and I told her everything. She didn't offer platitudes or try to fix anything. She just listened and occasionally refilled my wine glass. When I finished, she reached across the table and squeezed my hand. "My husband had an affair," she said. 23 years into our marriage, not with my sister. I can't imagine how much worse that makes it, but with his secretary. Very cliché. I took him back because everyone told me that's what you do, that's how you save a marriage. We had 15 more years together before he died, and you know what? They were the most miserable years of my life. I never trusted him again. I never felt safe again. Every time he was late coming home, every time his phone rang, I felt sick. If I could go back and give my younger self advice, I'd tell her to leave. I'd tell her she deserved better than spending 2 decades looking over her shoulder. Her words settled into my chest like stones, heavy and solid. She was right. Even if I wanted to, and I absolutely did not, I could never trust Jim again. This wasn't fixable. This wasn't something you got past. This was a demolition, and the only question was whether I was going to build something new or live in the rubble. Over the next few weeks, while Amy's wedding came and went, I didn't attend, didn't send a gift, didn't acknowledge it at all. I rebuilt my understanding of my own life. I found out later that she did go through with the wedding to Derek, though I couldn't imagine how. Did she tell him about the pregnancy? About Jim? Or did she stand there in her white dress and lie to another good man, the way she'd been lying to me for over a year? I didn't want to know. I didn't want to care. But late at night, when the house was quiet and I couldn't sleep, I found myself wondering about Derek. Poor Derek, who seemed like a decent guy, who'd been so excited about marrying Amy. Had he noticed anything strange about her relationship with Jim? Had he wondered why her older sister suddenly wasn't speaking to her? Or had they fed him some story about a falling out, something benign and fixable? The not knowing ate at me more than I wanted to admit. But I couldn't reach out. I couldn't be the one to destroy yet another person's happiness, even if that happiness was built on lies. That was Jim and Amy's responsibility, not mine. My attorney, a sharp woman in her 50s named Rebecca Chen, helped me see just how much I'd been contributing to Jim's business without proper compensation or recognition. I wasn't just his wife. I'd been his unpaid employee, his accountant, his business manager. And Illinois law, thankfully, recognized that. My first meeting with Rebecca was in her office in the Loop, a space that was somehow both professional and comforting. She had her law degrees on the wall, but also photographs of what I assumed were her children and a collection of small ceramic elephants on her bookshelf. She offered me tea instead of coffee, and when I started crying halfway through explaining the situation, she pushed a box of tissues across her desk and waited patiently for me to compose myself. "I've been doing this for 23 years, she told me when I apologized for crying. And I can tell you that tears are a normal part of this process. What's not normal is how thoroughly you've documented everything. Most clients come to me with emotions and scattered memories. You've come with a financial roadmap. That's going to make my job much easier." We spent 3 hours in that first meeting, going through everything. Rebecca asked detailed questions about my role in Jim's business, about the money I'd contributed over the years, about the work I'd done without compensation. She asked about our property, our retirement accounts, our investments. She asked about my health, my employment prospects, my living expenses. She was building a case, brick by brick, for why I was entitled to far more than Jim probably thought he'd have to pay. "Illinois is an equitable distribution state," she explained. "That doesn't mean equal, it means fair. And what's fair in your case is that you receive compensation for 41 years of unpaid labor, for the career opportunities you gave up to support your husband's business, for the contributions you made that enabled him to build wealth. You're not taking anything from him. You're receiving what you earned." I learned things about divorce law I'd never wanted to know. I learned about equitable distribution and spousal support and asset division. I learned that 41 years of marriage meant something, legally speaking, even if it had meant nothing to Jim personally. I learned that the work I'd done for his business entitled me to a significant portion of its worth. Jim tried to fight me at first. He hired his own attorney, a man who sent threatening letters about how I was being unreasonable, how I was trying to destroy everything we'd built together out of spite. But Rebecca was better. She documented everything, every hour I'd worked, every contribution I'd made, every lie Jim had told. She found more accounts I hadn't known about, more money he'd hidden. The secret account for Amy was just the tip of it. Rebecca hired a forensic accountant, a soft-spoken man named David who went through Jim's business records with the thoroughness of an archaeologist examining ancient ruins. He found things even I had missed: shell companies, investments in other people's names, money moved offshore. Jim had been planning his exit strategy for years, it turned out. He'd been systematically hiding assets, protecting himself financially while I'd been working to keep his business afloat. "This is actually good for you," David told me during one of our meetings. "It shows intent to deceive. It shows he was planning to leave you without your fair share. Judges don't look kindly on this kind of financial manipulation." When we finally sat down for mediation, 3 months after that rehearsal dinner, Jim looked diminished somehow. Amy had broken up with Derek, or maybe he'd broken up with her. I never asked for details, and she and Jim were living together in a condo downtown. The baby was due in 4 months. He was going to be a father at 65, starting over with a woman 20 years younger, and the reality of that seemed to be sinking in. The mediator was a patient woman who reminded me of a kindergarten teacher, carefully explaining to 2 children why they needed to share their toys fairly. We sat across from each other at a conference table, lawyers flanking us like seconds in a duel, and we divided up 41 years of shared life. The mediation took 2 full days. We went through every asset, every account, every piece of property. Jim's attorney tried to argue that much of the wealth was due to Jim's business acumen, not my contributions. Rebecca countered with detailed records of every client I'd managed, every account I'd reconciled, every bill I'd paid. She presented testimony from some of Jim's former clients who confirmed that they'd primarily dealt with me, not Jim. She showed the mediator emails where Jim had explicitly asked me to handle various aspects of the business, acknowledging my essential role. I got the brownstone. Jim had wanted to sell it and split the proceeds, but I refused. This was my home, the place I'd made beautiful, and I wasn't giving it up. I got a settlement that included half of his business value, calculated based on what it would be worth without my continued free labor. I got half of our retirement accounts and investments. I got spousal support for the next 10 years, a sum that would allow me to live comfortably while I figured out what I wanted to do with the rest of my life. Jim got his freedom, his new family, and a monthly support payment that would, as Rebecca pointed out with grim satisfaction, make supporting both me and Amy quite expensive. Sometimes karma doesn't strike like lightning. Sometimes it just drains your bank account slowly over years. But money wasn't what fixed me. Money helped. I'd be lying if I said it didn't. But the real healing came from somewhere else. It started with Susan, my neighbor, who refused to let me sit alone in my brownstone, feeling sorry for myself. She dragged me to a book club at the local library, where I met other women my age who had their own stories of survival and reinvention. There was Patricia, who'd left her husband after 30 years and started a successful catering business. There was Jean, whose husband had died and who discovered she was actually happier alone than she'd ever been married. There was Dolores, who'd never married at all and seemed perfectly content with that choice. They welcomed me into their circle, not because they pitied me, but because they recognized me. We were women who'd gotten to our 60s and discovered we had more life to live, more things to do, more versions of ourselves to explore. We met every 2 weeks, ostensibly to discuss books, but really we talked about everything. Aging parents, grown children, money, health, politics, dreams. They taught me that my life wasn't over just because my marriage was. I remember one evening in particular, about 2 months after the divorce was finalized. We were discussing a book about a woman who'd left her marriage in her 70s and traveled around the world. Patricia looked at me across the table and said, "You know what I love about getting older? Nobody expects anything from you anymore. When you're young, everyone's watching, judging, telling you what you should be doing. But at 60, people just assume you're done, and that's when you're finally free to actually live." Jean nodded vigorously. When my husband died, everyone expected me to be devastated forever, to wear black and sit in my house mourning. And I did mourn, I mourned deeply. But I also discovered I liked sleeping in the middle of the bed. I liked eating cereal for dinner. I liked not having to watch sports on TV every weekend. There's guilt in that admission, but there's also truth. Dolores, who'd been quiet, added, "I spent my 20s and 30s having everyone tell me something was wrong with me for not wanting to get married, like I was incomplete or damaged. But I knew myself. I knew I needed space and independence more than I needed a partner. And now, at 68, I've never been happier. I travel when I want. I spend my money how I want. I answer to no one. That's not loneliness. That's freedom." Their words gave me permission to feel what I was feeling. Not just the pain and anger, but also the relief. The secret relief that I didn't have to try anymore, didn't have to keep propping up a marriage that had been slowly suffocating me for years. I could just be Margaret, figuring out what Margaret wanted without Jim's needs and opinions clouding everything. Susan also introduced me to her financial advisor, a woman named Karen who specialized in helping women who'd gone through late-life divorces. Karen looked at my settlement and helped me understand that I had options, real options. I didn't have to go back to part-time bookkeeping if I didn't want to. I could invest conservatively and live off the income. I could start my own business. I could go back to school. I could travel. I could do whatever I wanted for the first time in my adult life. The mistake women make, Karen told me during one of our meetings, is thinking of this money as compensation for what you lost. It's not. It's capital for what you're going to build next. You're 63. If you live to 90, which is entirely possible these days, you've got 27 years ahead of you. That's more than a quarter of a century. What do you want to do with it? I didn't know. For weeks, I couldn't answer that question. I'd spent so long being Jim's wife, being Amy's big sister and surrogate mother, being the responsible one who kept everything running, that I'd forgotten how to want things just for myself. But slowly, wants started to surface. Small ones at first. I wanted to paint my bedroom a color I liked instead of the beige Jim had insisted was sophisticated. I wanted to eat dinner at 9 p.m. if I felt like it, instead of having it ready at 6:30 when Jim got home. I wanted to watch romantic comedies without someone sighing heavily and making comments about how unrealistic they were. I painted my bedroom a deep teal blue. I ate scrambled eggs for dinner at 10 p.m. I watched every Nora Ephron movie ever made. And then I started to want bigger things. I wanted to travel. I'd never been to Europe. Jim had always said it was too expensive, too touristy, too crowded. Looking back, I realized he'd always had an excuse for why we couldn't do the things I wanted. Too expensive, too impractical, too much work to plan. But he'd had no problem taking that trip to Vegas with his business buddies, or the golf weekend in Arizona, or any number of other things he wanted to do. My dreams were always negotiable. His never were. But I'd always dreamed of seeing Paris, of walking along the Seine and visiting the Louvre and eating croissants in sidewalk cafes. So, I booked a trip. 2 weeks in Paris, staying in a small hotel in the Marais that Patricia from book club recommended. The booking process itself was terrifying. I'd never planned a trip alone before. Jim had always handled travel arrangements, even though I'd done all the actual work of researching and organizing. He just made the final decisions and taken credit for the planning. Now, sitting at my computer, I had to figure out flights and hotels and travel insurance and all the logistics by myself. Part of me wanted to give up, to decide it was too complicated, too scary. But another part, a stronger part that was emerging from the rubble of my old life, refused to let fear win. If I could survive the betrayal of my husband and sister, if I could navigate a divorce and rebuild my finances and start my own business, I could certainly figure out how to book a trip to Paris. I was terrified. I'd never traveled alone before, but I went anyway. The night before my flight, I almost canceled. I stood in my bedroom looking at my packed suitcase and thought, what am I doing? I'm 63 years old. I don't speak French. I've never been to Europe. What if something goes wrong? What if I get lost or sick or robbed? What if I'm completely miserable and alone for 2 weeks? But then I thought about Jim and Amy, probably comfortable in their condo downtown, probably relieved that I was out of the way, making their lives easier by disappearing. And I thought, no, I'm not disappearing. I'm not making myself smaller to accommodate their betrayal. I'm going to Paris, and I'm going to have a wonderful time. And they're going to miss out on knowing this version of me, the version who's brave enough to travel alone, who's strong enough to build a new life. Paris in April was everything I'd imagined and nothing like I'd expected. It rained more than I'd thought it would. My feet hurt from walking on cobblestones. I got lost constantly because I couldn't read a map to save my life. But I also ate the best bread I'd ever tasted, saw art that made me cry, and spent an entire afternoon sitting in a park watching children play and old men feed pigeons and thought, this is what it feels like to just exist without having to be useful to someone. The hotel in the Marais was perfect, a small boutique place with only 12 rooms, run by a French couple in their 70s who seemed charmed by my terrible attempts at speaking their language. My room was tiny, with exposed wooden beams and a window that looked out onto a narrow street where I could hear people walking and talking at all hours. There was a bakery on the corner that opened at 6 in the morning, and I developed a routine of going there first thing, pointing at what I wanted since my French extended to about 20 words, and bringing my breakfast back to eat by my window. I visited the Louvre 3 separate times and still didn't see everything. I stood in front of the Mona Lisa, surrounded by crowds of tourists, all holding up their phones, and felt oddly emotional. Here was this painting that had survived centuries, that had been gazed upon by millions of people, that remained mysterious and beautiful despite everything. Maybe I could survive too. Maybe I could remain myself despite everything that had tried to diminish me. I went to Versailles and was overwhelmed by the opulence and the history. I walked through the Musée d'Orsay and discovered impressionist paintings I'd only ever seen in books. I took a boat cruise on the Seine at sunset and drank cheap wine from a plastic cup and didn't care that I was alone. I visited Notre Dame before the fire. I was lucky that way to have seen it intact, and sat in the pews and felt something approaching peace, even though I hadn't been religious in decades. I met a woman from Australia at my hotel, another solo traveler in her 60s who'd been divorced for 5 years. We had dinner together one night at a bistro near Notre Dame, and she told me about her life, how she'd spent 40 years married to a man who loved her, but also slowly suffocated her with his need for routine and control. How leaving had been the hardest and best thing she'd ever done. How she'd spent the last 5 years learning to sail and climbing mountains and taking cooking classes and dating when she felt like it and being alone when she preferred. "The thing is," she said, pouring us both more wine, "we're trained to think of this as the end. Like 60 is when life stops and you just wait around to get old and sick. But it's not. It's just another chapter. Maybe the best chapter, because now we know ourselves. We know what we don't want. We're not trying to please anyone or prove anything. We can just be." Her name was Caroline, and we exchanged email addresses before I left Paris. We still write to each other occasionally, sharing our adventures and discoveries. She sent me a photograph last month of herself on a sailboat somewhere in the Mediterranean, her gray hair wild in the wind, her face creased with laugh lines, looking absolutely radiant. That's what 60-something looks like, I thought when I saw it. Not the end, just a new beginning. I came home from Paris different, lighter somehow. I hung a painting I'd bought from a street artist in my teal bedroom. I started French lessons on an app, not because I needed to speak French, but because I wanted to. I joined a gym and started swimming laps in the mornings. I let my hair grow longer and stopped coloring it, let the gray come in silver and white. I bought clothes I actually liked instead of things that seemed appropriate for a woman my age. Jim and Amy had their baby in August, a boy they named Joshua. I found out from a mutual friend who thought I should know, as if that information mattered to me anymore. It didn't. I felt nothing when I heard it. No anger, no sadness, no curiosity. They were strangers to me now. People I used to know in a life I used to live. My father called me in September, 7 months after the rehearsal dinner that had changed everything. He was 86 and living in a retirement community in Florida, and he'd finally heard the full story from someone. He was calling to apologize for Amy, as if her choices were somehow his responsibility. "I don't blame you, Dad," I told him. "Amy made her choices. So did Jim. I'm just sorry you're caught in the middle of it." "Are you all right?" he asked, and I could hear real concern in his voice. "I mean really all right, not just saying you are?" I thought about it. Was I all right? My husband of 41 years had left me for my sister. I'd lost my marriage and my relationship with Amy in one devastating blow. Everything I thought was solid about my life had turned out to be built on sand. But I was sitting in my teal bedroom in my brownstone in Lincoln Park, planning a trip to Italy in the spring. I had friends who genuinely cared about me. I had enough money to support myself comfortably. I had time and freedom and possibilities stretching out ahead of me. "Yeah, Dad," I said. "I actually am all right. Maybe for the first time in a long time." The holidays were hard. Thanksgiving and Christmas had always been family affairs, big gatherings at our house or at my father's before he moved to Florida. I'd been dreading them, anticipating long, empty days filled with memories of how things used to be. But Susan invited me to join her family's Thanksgiving, and the book club women organized a Christmas potluck that was chaotic and loud and wonderful. Susan's Thanksgiving was at her daughter's house in Evanston, a warm, noisy gathering of 3 generations. I helped in the kitchen, mashing potatoes and stirring gravy, while children ran through the house and adults caught up on each other's lives. Susan's daughter, Jennifer, treated me like family, introducing me to relatives and making sure I had a seat at the main table. When they went around saying what they were grateful for, I found myself saying, "I'm grateful for new beginnings and unexpected friends," and meaning it. Christmas with the book club was different but equally healing. We each brought a dish and a small gift for the White Elephant Exchange. Dolores made her famous lasagna. Patricia brought a chocolate cake that was probably professional quality. Jean contributed a massive salad and homemade bread. I made my mother's old recipe for sugar cookies, shapes I'd cut out with cookie cutters I'd had for decades. Stars and trees and bells. It was the first time I'd made them since she died, and I cried a little while decorating them, but it felt good to connect to that memory. On New Year's Eve, I stood alone in my living room at midnight and made a toast to myself with a glass of champagne. "To Margaret," I said out loud to my empty house, to 63 years old and just getting started. January brought an unexpected development. Rebecca, my divorce attorney, called to tell me that Jim wanted to sell the consulting business. After the divorce settlement, he'd tried to keep it running, but without me handling all the back-end work, he was struggling. Clients were leaving, projects were being mismanaged. He was drowning, and he knew it. "He's asking if you'd be interested in buying him out," Rebecca said. "His asking price is actually quite reasonable, probably because he's desperate. With your settlement and the business knowledge you already have, you could afford it." I sat with that possibility for days. Did I want to run Jim's business? Did I want to step into that world of consulting and client management and all the stress that came with it? Part of me recoiled at the idea of taking on more work when I'd just started learning how to rest. But another part, the part that remembered being 22 and excited about her accounting career, that part was intrigued. I called Karen, my financial advisor. We ran the numbers. The business was undervalued because of its current struggles, but the client base was solid and the reputation was salvageable. With proper management, the kind of management I'd been providing for free for decades, it could be profitable again. More than that, it could be mine. Not Jim's business that I helped run. Mine. "If you do this," Karen said, "do it because you want to build something, not because you want to prove something to Jim. He's not the audience anymore." She was right. I didn't need to prove anything to Jim, but maybe I needed to prove something to myself, that I could build and run a successful business, that all those years of work had given me valuable skills and knowledge, that I was more than just the support system behind someone else's success. I bought the business. I renamed it, dropping Jim's name from the letterhead and calling it simply Hartwell Consulting. I hired 2 young women straight out of business school, smart and hungry and eager to learn. I restructured our service offerings and our pricing. I reached out to old clients and rebuilt relationships. I worked harder than I had in years, but this time it was for myself, building something that belonged to me. The first few months were brutal. I was learning to be not just the back-end support, but the face of the company. I had to attend networking events, pitch to potential clients, negotiate contracts. All things Jim had done while I'd stayed in the background. I was terrified at first. What if I wasn't good enough? What if the clients didn't respect me? What if I failed? My first networking event was at a downtown hotel, one of those professional mixers where everyone stands around with name tags and drinks, trying to make connections. I stood in the lobby for 10 full minutes before I could make myself go in. I kept thinking about how Jim used to work these rooms, so confident and charming, while I stayed home managing the actual business. What made me think I could do what he did? But then I remembered something Rebecca, my attorney, had told me during our sessions. "You've been running that business for years. Jim was just the salesman. You were the one who made sure promises got kept, who built the actual relationships with clients, who solved problems. You're not stepping into Jim's shoes. You're finally getting credit for what you've always done. So I walked in. I introduced myself to people. I talked about the business, my business, and what we could offer. And something strange happened. People listened. They asked questions. They gave me their business cards. One woman, a CFO for a mid-sized tech company, said, "I worked with Hartwell Consulting a few years ago. Are you related to Jim Hartwell?" When I explained I'd bought the business from my ex-husband and restructured it, she said, "Good. I always thought the back-end work was more impressive than the sales pitch anyway. Let's set up a meeting." That night, I went home exhausted but exhilarated. I'd done it. I'd walked into a room full of strangers and represented my own company, and I hadn't failed. In fact, I'd succeeded. I'd gotten leads, made connections, proven to myself that I was more than capable of doing this. But something interesting happened. The clients did respect me. In fact, many of them confessed they'd always preferred working with me over Jim. "Jim was good at selling," one client told me over lunch, "but you were the one who actually understood our business and solved our problems." Another client said, "Honestly, we were thinking about leaving when we heard about your divorce. We stayed because you took over." My two new hires, Jessica and Annika, brought fresh energy and ideas to the business. Jessica had a background in digital marketing and suggested we update our online presence. Annika was brilliant with data analysis and helped me develop new service offerings that were more aligned with what modern businesses needed. Together, we transformed the company from Jim's outdated consulting firm into something more dynamic and relevant. 6 months later, the business was thriving. We'd brought back most of the clients Jim had lost and acquired several new ones. I was making more money than I'd made from my settlement income. But more than that, I was enjoying it. I liked the problem solving, the client interactions, the satisfaction of a job well done. I liked having a purpose again, but on my own terms. On a Tuesday in June, almost exactly a year and a half after that rehearsal dinner, I ran into Jim at a coffee shop downtown. I was there meeting a client. He was there alone, holding a baby carrier with Joshua inside. The baby was fussy, crying those sharp infant cries that cut through conversation, and Jim looked lost, the way new fathers always do when they're out alone with a screaming baby. Our eyes met across the coffee shop. I waited for some feeling to hit me. Anger, satisfaction, pain, something. But there was nothing. He was just a man I used to know, struggling with a crying baby, no longer part of my story. He started to walk toward me, probably to try to talk, but I turned back to my client and continued our conversation. I didn't owe him my attention anymore. I didn't owe him anything. That evening, I went home to my brownstone and made myself dinner, a simple pasta with vegetables from the farmer's market. I ate on my back porch, watching the sun set over my garden. I'd planted tomatoes again that summer, and they were thriving, heavy with fruit. I'd also planted herbs and flowers, turning the small yard into something beautiful and productive. Susan came over after dinner, and we sat on the porch with glasses of wine, talking about nothing in particular. She was planning a trip to visit her daughter in California. I told her about the new client I'd landed that afternoon, a small startup that needed help structuring their finances. We talked about the book club's upcoming selection and complained about the construction on our street that was making parking impossible. It was an ordinary evening. Perfectly, wonderfully ordinary. And I realized that this was what I'd been missing during all those years with Jim. The simple pleasure of ordinary evenings, of conversations that didn't have to serve some purpose, of time that belonged entirely to me. My story doesn't have a dramatic ending. Jim and Amy are still together, as far as I know. They're raising Joshua in that downtown condo. Amy occasionally tries to reach out, birthday cards, texts on holidays, but I don't respond. Maybe someday I'll be ready to have some kind of relationship with her again, but that day isn't here yet. Maybe it never will be. And I've made peace with that. My father asks about me more often now, calls every couple of weeks just to chat. I think he feels guilty about what happened, about Amy's choices, but I keep telling him it's not his burden to carry. We're planning to spend Thanksgiving together this year, just the two of us in Florida. Something quiet and easy. The business continues to grow. I'm thinking about opening a second office, maybe bringing in a partner, or maybe I'll sell it in a few years and travel more. I have options. That's what money gives you. Not happiness, but options. The freedom to choose what comes next. I've learned things about myself over these past 18 months. I've learned that I'm stronger than I thought, more resilient, more capable of standing alone. I've learned that betrayal doesn't have to destroy you. It can remake you if you let it. I've learned that 63 isn't too old to start over, to build a new life, to discover who you are when you're not defined by someone else's needs and expectations. I've also learned something about forgiveness that surprised me. People always say you have to forgive to move on, but I'm not sure that's true. I haven't forgiven Jim. I haven't forgiven Amy. Maybe I never will, but I've moved on anyway. I've built a life I love without needing their redemption or apology or understanding. Their choices don't control my happiness anymore. That's not forgiveness exactly, but it's freedom, and freedom might be better. There are still hard days. Days when I'm lonely, when I miss having a partner, when I wonder if I'll spend the rest of my life alone. Days when I see couples my age, still together, still happy, and feel a pang of loss for what I thought I had. Days when I question whether I gave up too easily, whether I should have tried harder to save my marriage. On those days, I remind myself of something Susan told me early on. You can't save a marriage when only one person wants to be in it. Jim made his choice when he started that affair. He made his choice every time he met Amy in secret, every time he moved money into that account, every time he lied to your face. You didn't give up on your marriage. He did. You just had the dignity to acknowledge it. Sometimes I imagine what my life would look like if I'd tried to stay, if I'd been one of those women who forgives and tries to rebuild. Would Jim have ended things with Amy? Would he have really chosen me? Or would he have stayed out of obligation while resenting me for making him give up what he wanted? Would I have spent the rest of my life looking over my shoulder, checking his phone, wondering where he really was when he said he was working late? The answer is yes, I would have. Because that's what Susan did, and she told me those 15 years were torture. She told me she died a little bit every day, staying in a marriage where trust was gone, and I realized I'd rather be alone and whole than partnered and broken. Still, loneliness is real. There are Saturday nights when I sit in my brownstone, reading a book or watching a movie, and I feel the weight of solitude. Not in a bad way always. Sometimes it's peaceful. But sometimes I miss having someone to share things with, someone to tell about my day, someone to laugh with at dinner. But then I remember that I didn't have that with Jim anyway. Not really. Our conversations had become superficial years ago. We'd been living parallel lives in the same house, connected by habit and history, but not by genuine intimacy. So what am I really missing? The illusion of companionship? The comfort of familiar routine? Those aren't good enough reasons to stay in a marriage. They're not good enough reasons to accept betrayal. But those days are getting rarer. And they're balanced by so many good days. Days when I wake up excited about a project at work. Days when I meet friends for lunch and laugh until my sides hurt. Days when I sit in my teal bedroom reading a book with my cat curled up next to me and feel perfectly content. Last month, I went on a date. A man I met through one of my business clients. A widower in his late 60s who asked me to dinner. His name was Robert, and he'd lost his wife to cancer 2 years earlier. He was kind and interesting, a retired professor who talked about literature and travel and his grandchildren. We had a pleasant evening, good food and easy conversation at an Italian restaurant in Andersonville. But there was no spark, or maybe the spark was there but I wasn't ready to see it. I kept comparing him to Jim, not favorably to Jim, but just comparing. He laughed differently. He ordered different food. He told stories in a different way. Everything felt unfamiliar, and I couldn't decide if that was good or bad. When he walked me to my car, he said, "I really enjoyed this evening, Margaret. I'd like to see you again, if you're interested." And I stood there, keys in hand, trying to figure out what I wanted. Was I interested in Robert specifically, or was I just lonely? Was I ready to date, or was I just going through the motions because I thought I should be? I said yes, even though I wasn't sure I wanted to. But I'm trying to stay open to possibilities, trying not to let what Jim did close me off to the idea of companionship. We've been on 3 more dates since then. It's slow and careful, 2 people who've been hurt by life trying to figure out if there's room for something new. I don't know where it's going. Maybe nowhere. Maybe somewhere. But I'm learning that it's okay to not know, okay to take things slowly, okay to protect my heart while still remaining open to the possibility of connection. I don't know if I'll ever marry again. I don't know if I even want to. What I do know is that I'm not afraid of being alone anymore. There's a difference between being alone and being lonely, and I've learned to tell them apart. Alone is peaceful. Alone is having space to think and grow. Alone is freedom. If I could go back and talk to the woman I was at that rehearsal dinner, standing in that alcove watching my husband's hand on my sister's pregnant belly, I don't know what I'd tell her. Maybe that it's going to hurt worse than she can imagine. Maybe that she's going to survive it and come out stronger. Maybe that she should have trusted her instincts years ago. All those times she felt something was off, but talked herself out of it. Or maybe I'd just tell her that she deserves better, that she deserves to be loved honestly and treated with respect, that she deserves to build a life that's truly hers, not just a supporting role in someone else's story, that it's never too late to start over, to reclaim herself, to discover who she is when she's not trying to be what everyone else needs her to be. The sun is setting over Chicago as I write this, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink. Tomorrow I have a breakfast meeting with a potential client, then lunch with Patricia and Jean from book club, then an evening flight to Boston for a conference. My calendar is full of things I chose, people I want to see, places I want to go. I'm 64 years old. I've been divorced for a year. I have a business I love, friends who support me, a home that's entirely mine, and a future full of possibilities I'm only beginning to explore. My husband left me for my younger sister, and it nearly destroyed me. But it didn't. Instead, it freed me. That's what I've learned from all of this, that sometimes the worst thing that happens to you is also the best thing. Sometimes what feels like an ending is actually a beginning. Sometimes you have to lose everything you thought you wanted to discover what you actually need. I'm not grateful for what Jim and Amy did. I'm not thankful for the betrayal or the pain or the humiliation, but I am grateful for where it led me, to this life, this freedom, this version of myself that I'm only now getting to know and like. So that's my story. That's how I went from standing in a service corridor watching my world implode to sitting here now, whole and happy and free. It wasn't easy. It wasn't quick. There were days when I thought I wouldn't make it, when the pain felt too big to survive. But I did make it. I did survive. And not just survive. I'm thriving in ways I never did during 41 years of marriage. If you're going through something similar, if you've been betrayed or abandoned or underestimated, I want you to know that you can survive it too. You can build a new life. You can discover strengths you didn't know you had. You can be happy again, maybe happier than you've ever been. It won't happen overnight,